그 차를 마시지 마세요, 작은 새. 사냥꾼이 이미 덫을 놓았습니다.
The silver spoon clinked against the crystal glass with a steady beat, a sound that didn't signal a friendly toast, but a countdown to a tragedy. In the golden light of the fancy restaurant, the mean businessman, Hajin, leaned toward the young Nayeon. He pushed a cup of drugged tea toward her with a greasy, evil smile. He thought he was just trapping a rich girl he could use for money. He didn't notice the black waitress leaning in to refill the water, her eyes sharp and focused. As she leaned down, her voice dropped into a tiny whisper of perfect, high-society Korean. "Do not drink the tea, little bird. The hunter has already set the trap." The shock wasn't just a warning. It was that she spoke the language so perfectly. To everyone in the room, Amara was just a nobody in a stained uniform, someone who shouldn't understand a word of their private secrets. But her secret was a weapon. By breaking her silence to protect the Mafia Boss's daughter, she had stepped right into the middle of a dangerous war. The air in the room changed instantly. Hajin's smug smile turned into anger as he realized the waitress was helping his prey. At that exact moment, the heavy brass doors of the restaurant swung open. A man in a long black coat stepped out of the shadows. It was Minjun, the Iron King of the city, and his scary gaze locked onto the waitress who was standing like a human shield for his child. Hajin thought he was bullying a helpless girl, but as the first red laser from a guard's gun landed on his chest, he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The Soul Bistro was a place where the air always smelled of expensive butter and cold pride. Amara moved through the dining room like a ghost in a black and white uniform. She was fast, quiet, and invisible. To the wealthy people sitting at the tables, she wasn't a person. She was just a pair of hands that brought their wine and took away their dirty plates. But under the serving counter, hidden behind a stack of clean napkins, lay Amara's real life. It was a thick, worn-out linguistics textbook filled with notes in the margins. Every time she had 10 seconds to breathe, she would glance at the complicated symbols and ancient Korean dialects. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a student with a brain like a sponge, soaking up every language she could find. Working here was a choice made of necessity, not joy. Every tip she tucked in her pocket felt heavy. It wasn't for a new dress or a night out. It was for the stack of bills sitting on her kitchen table at home, the family debt that felt like a giant stone she had to carry every single day. Her father had worked himself to the bone, and now that he was gone, the weight was hers. "Waitress, this soup is lukewarm. Are you deaf as well as slow?" The voice belonged to a man in a suit that cost more than Amara's car. He was red-faced and mean, looking at her as if she were a bug he wanted to squash. A younger version of Amara might have cried or snapped back, but the current Amara just stood there with a scary kind of patience. She didn't blink. She didn't frown. She simply tilted her head, her eyes calm and cold, watching him. It was the look of someone who knew exactly how many ways she could insult him in 5 different languages without him ever knowing. "I apologize, sir," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "I will bring you a fresh bowl immediately." She turned away before he could say another word. She didn't let the anger touch her. She couldn't afford to get fired. Not today. Not when the rent was due and her little brother needed new shoes for school. As she walked toward the kitchen, she felt the familiar burn in her feet and the ache in her back. She was tired of being invisible. She was tired of the smell of grease and the sound of rich people complaining about things that didn't matter. She felt like a tiger trapped in a very small, very boring cage. She reached the counter and took a quick peek at her book. She whispered a few words of a rare, high-society Korean dialect under her breath. It was a language used by kings and queens, full of hidden meanings and sharp warnings. She liked the way the words felt in her mouth, powerful and secret. She had no idea that in just a few hours, those secret words would be the only thing standing between an innocent girl and a monster. She had no idea that her invisible life was about to explode into a world of fire and steel. For now, she just closed her book, picked up a tray of drinks, and stepped back out into the golden light of the bistro, waiting for the night that would change everything. The golden clock on the bistro wall ticked toward 8, and the heavy front doors opened with a cold rush of wind. Amara straightened her apron, her eyes scanning the new arrivals. A man walked in first, his suit shiny and expensive, but his posture felt wrong. This was Hajin. He moved with a smug, oily confidence that made Amara's skin crawl. But it was the girl walking behind him that made Amara's heart stop. The girl, Neon, looked like she belonged in a palace. She wore a silk dress the color of pearls and held a designer bag that cost more than Amara's entire education. She looked young, innocent, and completely out of place in a private room with a man like Hajin. As they walked past the service station, Amara caught a glimpse of Neon's profile. Internal alarm bells began to scream in Amara's head. She had seen that face before, not in person, but in the blurred photos on the news and the dark whispers that traveled through the city. Those high cheekbones and that proud chin belonged to the Park family, the notorious syndicate that ruled the city shadows. This girl wasn't just a wealthy student. She was the daughter of Minjun, the Iron King. Hajin led Neon to the most secluded table in the back. Amara followed them, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. She watched Hajin pull out a chair for the girl, his smile too wide, his eyes too hungry. He wasn't looking at a dinner date. He was looking at a prize. "We will have the special tea service," Hajin said, his voice sounding like gravel hitting silk. He didn't even look at the menu. "And make sure it's the private blend I requested earlier." Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. In a high-end bistro like this, special blends brought in by customers usually meant trouble. She stood at the side station, pretending to polish a tray while she watched Hajin reach into his pocket. He thought he was being clever, hiding his hand beneath the tablecloth, but Amara saw the tiny, clear vial. She saw him tip it into the teapot the moment the waiter set it down. It wasn't sugar, and it wasn't honey. It was a sedative, a drug meant to put the Iron King's daughter into a deep, helpless sleep. Amara looked around the room. The other waiters were busy. The manager was laughing with a regular at the bar. No one saw the trap being set. No one realized that a kidnapping was happening in the middle of a five-star dinner. If she stayed silent, Hajin would walk out of here with Neon, and the girl would disappear forever. Amara's hands shook against the cold metal of the tray. She knew the rules. Stay invisible, stay quiet, don't get involved. If she interfered, Hajin could destroy her life. But if she didn't, Neon wouldn't have a life left to live. She looked at her linguistics book hidden under the counter. She thought about the ancient, powerful dialects she had studied, the language of kings who protected their own. She realized that her invisible life was over. She couldn't be a ghost tonight. She took a deep breath, grabbed a pitcher of water, and walked toward the predator's table. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only person in the room who knew the truth, and she was about to use her secret weapon to break the hunter's snare. Amara walked toward the table with a pitcher of water, her heart drumming against her ribs. She could see the faint swirl of the sedative still dissolving in the tea. Neon reached for the cup, her small hand moving closer to the trap. Amara knew she had only seconds. She leaned in, pretending to check the water glasses. Her shadow fell over Neon, momentarily blocking Hajin's view. In a voice so quiet it was almost a breath, Amara spoke. The words were in a sharp, elegant Korean dialect that only the highest members of the syndicate used. "Do not drink the tea, little bird. The hunter has already set the snare." Neon froze. Her fingers stopped an inch from the handle. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. She wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. She was looking at someone who knew her secret language. But Amara had lingered a second too long. Hajin's eyes narrowed. He didn't understand the words, but he felt the change in the air. He saw the way his prey had suddenly stopped moving. His oily face twisted into a look of pure malice. He didn't like being interrupted, especially by someone he considered beneath him. "What did you say to her?" Hajin barked. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a loud clatter. "I was just offering more water, sir," Amara said, her voice trembling slightly as she stepped back. She tried to put on her invisible mask again, but it was too late. Hajin reached out and snatched the hot teapot from the tray. With a cruel sneer, he tilted it over Amara's arm. the steaming liquid soaked in her white sleeve, the heat stinging her skin. Amara gasped, but she didn't move. "You're clumsy," Hodgin hissed. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "And you're loud. You think you're important because you work in a room with gold on the walls? You're a servant. You're nothing." To show his power, Hodgin yanked on her arm. The sound of ripping fabric filled the quiet room. The sleeve of Amara's uniform tore away, leaving her arm bare and red from the tea. He laughed, a dry, mean sound, as he tossed the scrap of white cloth onto the floor. "Look at you," he mocked, pointing at her torn dress. "Now you look exactly like what you are. Trash." Nayeon watched with a pale face, her hands trembling. She looked at the torn sleeve, then at the calm, fierce look that was beginning to grow in Amara's eyes. Amara didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, her head held high, even as the hot tea dripped from her skin. Hodgin thought he had just humiliated a waitress. He thought he had asserted his dominance over a nobody. He had no idea that by tearing that sleeve, he had just declared war on the Park Syndicate. He had no idea that the girl he just branded as trash was currently the only person keeping him alive. At that moment, the lights in the bistro flickered once. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy and cold. Amara didn't look at Hodgin. She looked at the front door. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a silent alarm being triggered, not by the restaurant, but by the high-tech tracker hidden in Nayeon's designer bag. "You shouldn't have done that," Amara whispered, her voice no longer trembling. Hodgin laughed again, reaching for his tea. "Or what? You'll call the manager." "No," Amara said, her eyes locking onto the heavy brass doors as they began to groan open. "I won't have to call anyone. They're already here." The heavy brass-bound doors of the bistro didn't just open. They groaned under the weight of an authority that didn't belong in a quiet corner of the city. The chime of the bell, usually a cheerful announcement of a new customer, was silenced by the synchronized thud of polished combat boots. A sudden, icy draft swept through the room, carrying the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. 6 men in charcoal gray tactical suits, Minjun's personal blackguard, filed in with a precision that turned the cozy dining room into a parade ground. Their presence was a physical pressure, a reminder that the world outside was governed by power, and right now, that power was focused on this single room. Hodgin smoothed the lapels of his suit, a smirk finally twitching at the corner of his lips. He looked at the chaos on the floor, the shattered porcelain, the spilled tea, and Nayeon, who was still kneeling to help Amara clean the mess. To him, this was the moment of restoration. The hierarchy was about to be reset. Finally, Hodgin muttered, his voice dripping with a mix of relief and malice. He stepped forward, gesturing toward the 2 women on the floor with a flick of his wrist. "You're just in time. This waitress has been incredibly disrespectful. Please, clear the area and ensure these 2 are escorted out immediately. They've disrupted my afternoon long enough." He waited for the familiar sound of a harsh command, the metallic click of a restraint, or the rough hauling of Nayeon to her feet. He expected the guards to treat them like the debris on the floor. Instead, the air went still. The lead guard, a man whose face was a mask of granite, didn't even glance at Hodgin. He stepped past the wealthy businessman as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. With a sharp, synchronized motion, the 6 guards turned toward the center of the room. Then, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. In one fluid movement, the black guard dropped. They didn't just stop, they knelt. Their right knees hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, rhythmic crack that echoed off the ceiling. Their heads bowed in perfect unison, eyes fixed firmly on the ground. "We await your command," the lead guard said, his voice a low, reverent rumble. Hodgin froze. His hand, still raised to point a finger at Nayeon, began to tremble. "What are you doing? I'm the one who called." "She's the one. Be silent," the guard snapped, not even looking up. The command wasn't a request. It was a warning that one more word would be a fatal mistake. Nayeon didn't look surprised. She slowly stood up, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The clumsy waitress persona vanished like smoke in a gale. Her posture shifted, her shoulders squaring with a grace that made the modest bistro apron look like a royal robe. Beside her, Amara rose as well, her expression shifting from fear to a terrifying, quiet calm. The silence in the bistro was absolute, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of Hajin. He looked from the kneeling elite soldiers to the woman he had just tried to humiliate. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't been the predator in this room. He hadn't even been a player. He was just a nuisance that had finally caught the attention of something far larger and much more dangerous than himself. Naeon looked down at the kneeling men, then glanced at the shattered tea set. Her eyes, once warm and apologetic, were now as cold as the Iron King's heart. "You're late," she said simply. "Our apologies, Lady Naeon," the guard replied, his head bowing even lower. "The perimeter is secure. How do you wish to handle the interruption?" Naeon turned her gaze toward Hajin, who looked as though he might collapse. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been demolished. The transition was so fast, it felt like a fever dream. One moment, Amara was standing amidst broken porcelain in a dusty bistro. The next, she was being swept through the city in the back of a black sedan with windows so dark the world outside ceased to exist. When the car finally stopped, the doors were opened by men who didn't speak. They led her into a structure of glass and steel that rose into the clouds like a jagged needle. This was Minjun's fortress, a place where the air felt thinner and everything smelled of filtered oxygen and cold metal. As the elevator climbed, the city below shrank until the people looked like ants and the bustling streets became nothing more than glowing veins of light. "Step inside," a guard directed, gesturing toward a suite that looked more like a gallery than a living space. Amara walked in, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished marble. The room was breathtaking, filled with high-tech screens that flickered with data and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the horizon. But to Amara, it didn't feel like a home or even a hotel. It felt like a cage, expensive, beautiful, and inescapable. A maid appeared silently, holding a tray with a silk robe and soft slippers. "You are a protected witness now, Miss Amara," the woman said in a hushed tone. "These are for you. Please, make yourself comfortable." Amara looked at the silk. It was a far cry from her stained apron, but she didn't reach for it. She felt out of place, a small, blurred smudge on a perfectly clean canvas. She paced the length of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe from Hajin, yes, but the weight of Minjun's protection felt just as heavy as a threat. The heavy door slid open with a mechanical hiss. Minjun walked in, his presence instantly shrinking the vast room. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, but he still looked like a man who held the world's strings in his hands. He didn't offer a greeting. He walked straight to a terminal, tapped a few keys, and a recording of the warning Amara had delivered earlier began to play. The distorted, rhythmic chanting filled the room. To anyone else, it was just noise, a guttural, ancient-sounding dialect that had been dead for centuries. Minjun turned to her, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. He stepped into her personal space, his shadow falling over her. "That dialect," he said, his voice a low, dangerous silk. "That specific sequence of sounds hasn't been spoken in a public forum in 300 years. My linguists have spent 3 hours trying to trace its origin. They found nothing." He leaned closer, his gaze searching her face as if he could peel back her skin to find the secrets underneath. "And yet, you spoke it perfectly. You didn't just repeat it. You understood the inflection. You knew the weight of the threat before the words even left your mouth." Amara swallowed hard, her back hitting the cold glass of the window. "I told you. I just heard it. I remembered it. Nobody just remembers a dead language of the high courts, Amara." Minjun countered, his hand resting on the glass beside her head, effectively pinning her in place. "That dialect is a ghost. It belongs to a lineage that was supposed to be extinct." He reached out, his thumb grazing her jawline. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the touch of a man examining a rare, stolen artifact. He was obsessed, not with her, but with the mystery she represented. "Who are you?" he whispered, his eyes narrowed. "And how does a girl who scrubs floors know the language of kings?" Amara looked out at the city, the lights blurring as tears pricked her eyes. She was a prisoner of her own memory, trapped in a fortress of glass. With the most powerful man in the country demanding answers she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Minjun stood before a wall of monitors that bathed his face in a flickering blue light. Behind him, 3 of the world's top cryptographers sat hunched over their keyboards, their fingers flying in a desperate race against time. Lines of green code cascaded down the screens, flickering red every time a decryption attempt failed. "It's no use, sir," the lead technician said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The encryption on Hodgen's intercepted message is unlike anything we've seen. It's not a standard algorithm. It's as if the data itself is shifting every time we try to isolate a pattern. It's a ghost in the machine." Minjun's jaw tightened. He hated the word impossible. He looked at the garbled text on the center screen, a chaotic jumble of symbols and fragments that looked more like static than language. To his team, it was a digital puzzle. To him, it was a wall standing between him and the people trying to destroy his empire. Amara stood in the corner of the command center, feeling small in her oversized silk robe. She had been watching the screens for the last hour, her eyes tracking the symbols that the experts dismissed as noise. The more she looked, the more the tightness in her chest began to ease, replaced by a strange, humming familiarity. "It's not shifting," she said softly. The room went silent. The technicians turned to look at her with expressions ranging from annoyance to pity. Minjun, however, turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" he asked. Amara stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She pointed to a repeating string of 3 symbols that looked like twisted vines. "You're treating it like a computer code. You're looking for math. But this isn't math. It's a lilt." "A lilt?" the lead tech scoffed. "Young lady, this is a 256-bit encryption layer. It's a linguistic cipher," Amara countered, her voice growing steadier. She moved closer to the screen, her eyes dancing over the symbols. "It's from a village in the northern valleys, a place that hasn't been on a map for a century. They didn't write their secrets, they sang them. The code changes based on the rhythm of the folk songs they used to tell their history." She reached out, her finger hovering over the console. Minjun stepped aside, gesturing for the technicians to move. He watched her with a predatory curiosity. "Show me," he commanded. Amara didn't use the keyboard. She used the touchscreen to drag and drop fragments of the message, rearranging them not by size or frequency, but by the way the sounds would feel in the throat. She grouped the vines with the circles, aligning them like verses in a poem. "In that village," she whispered, almost to herself, "you never start with the truth. You start with the setting of the sun." She tapped a final sequence, a sequence that looked completely illogical to the computer's processors. For a heartbeat, the screen remained dark. Then, the red error lights vanished. The scrambled symbols melted away, rearranging themselves into clear, terrifyingly legible text. The technicians gasped. The uncrackable message was now a plain text map of Minjun's logistics routes, marked with specific times for an ambush. Minjun looked at the screen, then back at Amara. The silence in the room was heavy. She had done in 4 minutes what his multi-million-dollar team couldn't do in 4 hours. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a key to a world he didn't understand. "How did you know that village existed?" Minjun asked, his voice barely a whisper. Amara pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. The adrenaline faded, leaving her feeling exposed. "My grandmother. She used to sing me to sleep with those patterns. I didn't know they were a code. I just thought they were stories." Minjun stepped toward her, the intensity in his gaze enough to make her breath hitch. He realized then that Hodgen wasn't just using high-tech weapons. He was using the bones of the past, and he had just found the only person alive who knew how to make them speak. The fortress was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as the clock struck midnight, the air changed. The subtle hum of the building's ventilation system faltered for a fraction of a second, a hiccup in the heartbeat of the skyscraper. On the security monitors, shadows detached themselves from the walls. Hodgen's men had arrived, moving like ghosts through the maintenance shafts, bypassing the biometric locks that were supposed to keep the world out. Amara sat on the edge of her bed, her ears ringing with a sudden, sharp frequency. She didn't need the monitors to tell her they were here. She felt the vibration of their footsteps through the floorboards, a rhythmic tapping that felt like a threat written in skin and bone. In the command center, the alarms remained silent. The attackers had uploaded a loop to the cameras, showing empty hallways and sleeping guards. Minjun was in his private study, 3 floors away, cut off by a digital firewall the raiders had slammed into place. Amara stood up, her heart racing. She realized that if she waited for the Blackguard to save her, she would be dead before they even knew the perimeter was breached. She ran to the wall-mounted control panel in her suite. Her fingers trembled as she accessed the manual override, a backup system that relied on old-fashioned copper wiring rather than the compromised digital network. She didn't grab a weapon. Instead, she put on the headset. Through the earpiece, she could hear the raiders breathing. They were in the north corridor, 3 levels down, moving toward the elevators. Amara closed her eyes, visualizing the layout of the building as if it were the village maps from her grandmother's stories. "Turn left," she whispered into the intercom, her voice low and melodic. She didn't broadcast it to the whole building. She targeted the localized speaker right above the lead raider's head. The man froze, his suppressed rifle snapping upward. The sound of her voice, distorted by the ancient lilt she had used to crack the code, sounded less like a human and more like a glitch in reality. "The path is open," she murmured, switching the audio to a speaker at the far end of a dead-end hallway. The raiders, confused by the source of the sound, followed the whisper. They moved away from the elevator and toward the heavy-duty pressure chambers used for fire suppression. To them, the voice sounded like a command from their own comms, a guiding hand in the dark. Amara watched the heat signatures on her small screen. She was ghosting them, using the building's own acoustics to create echoes that shouldn't exist. She whispered a series of sharp, percussive sounds into the mic, mimicking the clatter of a guard's boots in the opposite direction. The attackers scrambled, their discipline crumbling under the weight of the unknown. They were elite soldiers, trained for heat and lead, but they weren't prepared for a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Now Amara breathed. She slammed her palm against the emergency seal. With a deafening hiss of hydraulic fluid, the reinforced steel shutters of the pressure chamber slammed shut, trapping the 4 men in a soundproof box. The magnetic locks engaged with a heavy thud that vibrated through the entire floor. Silence returned to the fortress. Minutes later, the door to her suite burst open. Minjun was there, his face pale, a handgun gripped in his steady hand. He looked at the monitors, then at Amara, who was still wearing the headset, her face drained of color. He saw the trapped men on the screen, beating fruitlessly against the glass of the suppression chamber. He looked at the intercom system, still glowing active under her hand. "They didn't even see you," Minjun said, his voice thick with a mixture of shock and something that looked like awe. Amara slowly took off the headset. Her hands were shaking so hard she had to tuck them into the sleeves of her silk robe. "They followed the sound," she said quietly. "In the old stories, the wind always leads the hunter into the trap. I just had to be the wind." Minjun stepped closer, looking at her as if he were seeing a person for the first time. He had built a fortress of steel, but she had defended it with nothing but a whisper. The adrenaline from the raid had faded, leaving behind a heavy, hollow silence that felt more suffocating than the noise. Minjun led Amara away from the command center, guiding her to a private balcony that overlooked the sleeping city. The wind-up here was cold and sharp, tugging at the edges of her silk robe. Minjun stood at the railing, his silhouette sharp against the glowing horizon. For the first time since they met, the mask of the Iron King seemed to slip. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deepening in the moonlight. "My father was a man who believed in walls," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. "He built this company this fortress, thinking that if he made things strong enough, nothing could hurt us. He was wrong. Amara stayed quiet, sensing that this wasn't a conversation, but a confession. 10 years ago, a rival family didn't attack our buildings. They attacked our movement. Minjun continued, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the railing. They intercepted a convoy. My parents were inside. Nayeon was only a child, hidden in a floor compartment. She watched through a gap in the wood as they took everything from us. He turned to look at Amara. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were filled with a burning, protective fire. Nayeon is the only thing left of a world that made sense. That is why the Blackguard kneels to her. That is why I am a monster to the rest of the world, so she never has to be afraid again. Amara felt a pang of sympathy that surprised her. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of a crown he hadn't asked for but refused to take off. But Hajin is using the old ways, Minjun said, his tone shifting back to business, though a hint of vulnerability remained. He is using the songs of the valley and the shadows of our history. My tech, my soldiers, my money, they can't fight a ghost. But you can. He walked over to a small stone table and picked up a tablet. With a single swipe, he brought up a file that made Amara's heart stop. It was her family's financial record, the predatory loans her father had taken, the mounting interest, and the legal threats that had kept her working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. I know about the debt, Minjun said. I know how many hours you've spent scrubbing floors to pay for a mistake that wasn't yours. He stepped closer, his presence commanding yet strangely respectful. I'm making you an offer, Amara. Not as a waitress, and not as a witness. I want you as my strategist. I want your ears, your voice, and that mind of yours that sees the patterns no one else can. He tapped the screen, and a red paid stamp appeared over her family's debt. It was a digital ghost of a pen stroke that changed her entire life in a second. In exchange, you stay here. You become the shield for my sister and the sword for my house. Your family will never want for anything again. They will be moved to a private estate, protected and provided for, as long as you are by my side. Amara looked at the screen, then at the man who held her future in his hands. It was the dream she had prayed for every night. Freedom for her parents, safety for herself. But as she looked at the high-tech walls of the fortress, she realized the price. She wouldn't be a waitress anymore, but she wouldn't be free either. She would be a bird in a gilded cage, singing for the king. You want me to be your ghost, she whispered. I want you to be the reason we survive, Minjun replied. Amara looked out at the city lights. She thought of her father's tired eyes and her mother's worn hands. Then she looked at Minjun, a man who had everything but understood nothing of the world she came from. I accept, she said, her voice firm. Minjun nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Then let us begin. Hajin thinks he's playing a game of shadows. It's time we showed him what happens when the light goes out. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the fortress, but the light felt cold. Amara sat in the sleek command center, now dressed in a tailored suit that felt like a suit of armor. In front of her, digital maps pulsed with data, tracking the movement of Minjun's Blackguard. We have a confirmed sighting, the head of security announced, pointing to a flickering red dot on the screen. Hajin's inner circle is moving toward the old shipyards on the southern docks. Intercepted comms suggest they're preparing a shipment of the very artifacts used to coordinate the raids. Minjun stood over the table, his eyes fixed on the target. Send 2 teams. I want them pinned down before they can reach the water. If they have the source of the ciphers, we end this today. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Orders were shouted, and within minutes, the heavy vibrations of transport choppers echoed through the building. Amara watched as the dots representing the guards moved away from the fortress, surging toward the docks. Nayeon was upstairs in the rooftop garden, protected by only a skeleton crew, thinking the danger was miles away. Amara stared at the intercepted emergency message that had triggered the move. It was a short burst of text, written in the same ancient dialect she had cracked before. The great river carries the sun to the grave at the rusted harbor, it read. To the linguists and the soldiers, it was a clear location, the harbor, But as Amara whispered the words to herself, her blood turned to ice. The rhythm was wrong. In the valley dialect, the word for harbor and the word for high tower were nearly identical in spelling, distinguished only by a subtle vowel shift that mimicked the sound of a rising wind. "Stop," Amara said, her voice small against the noise of the room. No one heard her. "Stop the teams," she shouted, standing up so quickly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. Minjun turned, his brow furrowed. "Amara, what is it?" "The teams are already halfway there." "The message," she said, her finger trembling as she pointed at the screen. "You're reading it as a direction, but the cadence is a warning. The word they used isn't harbor. It's nest. They aren't going to the shipyards to hide. They sent that message to make you clear the nest, this building." The lead technician shook his head. "The GPS coordinates were embedded in the metadata, Miss Amara. They pointed directly to the docks. They fed you what you wanted to see." Amara stepped closer to Minjun, her eyes pleading. "In the old songs, when the river carries the sun to the grave, it means the light is being led into the dark so the shadow can strike the home. It's a linguistic mirror. They aren't at the docks. They're already inside the ventilation shafts of the upper floors." Just as the words left her mouth, the lights in the command center flickered and died. The emergency red glow kicked in, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. A muffled explosion sounded from far above, directly beneath the rooftop garden where Neon was painting. Minjun's face went deathly pale. He realized in an instant that he had left his sister unprotected, lured away by a digital lie that only Amara had the soul to hear. "Com link to the garden." Minjun roared, grabbing his radio. Only static answered him. The great river wasn't the harbor. It was the flow of his own men leaving the building, leaving the sun, Neon, to the grave. Amara didn't wait for a command. She grabbed a tablet and began rerouting the internal security shutters. "I can slow them down," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "But you have to get to her now. The shadows aren't coming. They're already here." The elevators were dead, and the stairwells were filled with the smell of smoke. Minjun moved like a whirlwind, his weapon drawn, but his face was a mask of pure terror. Behind him, Amara struggled to keep up, her lungs burning as they climbed toward the rooftop garden. She wasn't a soldier, but she held the most powerful weapon in the building, a portable transmitter patched into the attacker's private radio frequency. "They've reached the garden entrance," a guard shouted over the comms. "We're pinned down." Minjun looked at Amara, his eyes desperate. "Do something. Anything." Amara huddled against the concrete wall of the stairwell, her fingers flying across the tablet. She had recorded the voice of the man who had spoken to Hajin in the earlier intercepted files, the man they called the Elder. His voice was a rasping, low growl, flavored with the thick accent of the northern provinces. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She didn't just need to sound like him. She needed to feel the weight of his authority. She needed to use the specific, jagged rhythm of the dialect that demanded absolute obedience. "Wait," she whispered to Minjun. She adjusted the pitch on her tablet to deepen her tone and clicked the transmitter to the enemy's main channel. "Listen to me," she barked into the mic. She wasn't Amara anymore. Her voice had transformed into a harsh, commanding rasp that sounded decades older. "The nest is a trap. The Iron King has leaked the false plans. The Blackguard is already behind you. Retreat to the secondary extraction point immediately." On the other side of the radio, there was a stunned silence. Then a panicked voice crackled back. "But sir, we have the girl in our sights. We can take her now." Amara didn't hesitate. She used a specific northern curse, a word so old and sharp it felt like a slap through the airwaves. "Fool, you're walking into a kill zone. If you stay another 30 seconds, you will be buried in this steel grave. Move to the service tunnels now, or I will leave you to hang." Through the heavy metal doors leading to the garden, they heard the sounds of confusion. The disciplined footsteps of the attackers suddenly became frantic and disorganized. To them, the voice of their leader was absolute. If he told them they were walking into a trap, they didn't question it, they ran. They're breaking, Minjun hissed, realizing the pressure on the garden entrance had suddenly vanished. Amara kept her finger on the button, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Drop your equipment and move. Every second you waste is a second closer to your death. The great river is closing. The sound of boots retreated down the far hallway, echoing as the kidnappers scrambled toward what they thought was a safe exit. In reality, they were running directly toward the lower-level security bay, where Minjun's returning teams were waiting to intercept them. Minjun kicked open the garden doors. Nayeon was huddled behind a stone fountain, her eyes wide with fear, but she was untouched. He sprinted to her, pulling her into a fierce embrace, his head resting against hers in a rare display of raw emotion. Amara leaned against the doorframe, her legs finally giving out. She slid down to the floor, the tablet heavy in her lap. The voice she had used, the voice of a cold, calculated killer, faded away, leaving her feeling small and exhausted. Minjun looked up from his sister. He looked at Amara, who was sitting in the shadows of the doorway, looking more like the tired waitress he had met in the bistro than a master strategist. He realized then that she hadn't just used her mind, she had used her soul to protect his family. They're gone, Amara whispered, her own voice returning. They believed me. They believed you because you knew exactly what they feared, Minjun said, his voice thick with gratitude. He reached out a hand to help her up, his grip steady and warm. You didn't just save my sister, Amara. You just won the war. The air inside the shipping container was thick with the smell of rust and salt. Rain drummed against the metal roof like 1,000 tiny hammers, and a single swinging bulb overhead cast long, flickering shadows. Hajin sat on a wooden crate, his expensive suit ruined and his face streaked with sweat. For the first time, he looked small. Minjun stood in the center of the container, his silhouette dark and terrifying. He held a silenced pistol at his side, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The silence was heavy, broken only by Hajin's ragged breathing. Please, Minjun, Hajin stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. We've been associates for years. This was just business. I can make it right. I'll leave the country. I'll give you whatever you want. Minjun raised the weapon, his gaze cold and final. You went after my sister, Hajin. There is no negotiation for that. Wait. Amara stepped out from the shadows behind Minjun. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She walked forward until she was standing between the Iron King and the man who had tried to destroy them. Minjun frowned. Amara, move aside. He doesn't deserve a quick end, but he needs to be gone. If you kill him now, he wins, Amara said softly, her voice steady in the echoing space. He dies a martyr for his cause, and his faction stays rich. They'll just find a new leader and come for Nayeon again tomorrow. We don't just need him gone. We need him erased. She turned her attention to Hajin. He looked at her with a flicker of hope, thinking she was his savior. He didn't see the ice in her eyes. You have 3 hidden accounts, Hajin, Amara said, her voice dropping into that melodic, haunting rhythm of the northern dialect. One in the Caymans, one in Zurich, and the one you think no one knows about, the shadow ledger tied to the old valley trade. Hajin's face went pale. How could you possibly know that? The same way I knew your codes, she replied. You used the old language to hide your money, thinking no one could read the trail. But the patterns always lead back to the source. She leaned in closer, her presence suddenly as overwhelming as Minjun's. Unlock them. Transfer every cent to the foundations that support the families your raids destroyed. Bankrupt your faction, or let Minjun finish what he started. Hajin looked at the gun, then back at Amara. He realized she wasn't offering mercy. She was offering a different kind of execution. Without his wealth, he was nothing. He would be a man without a name, without power, and without friends. With trembling hands, Hajin pulled a small, encrypted device from his pocket. Amara watched him, her eyes sharp, ensuring every keystroke followed the pattern she knew. She dictated the commands in the ancient tongue, forcing him to dismantle his empire piece by piece. The device chirped a final, high-pitched note. A balance, 0.00 flashed across the screen. Hodgin slumped back against the metal wall, his spirit broken. "It's gone," he whispered. "Everything I worked for. Now he's just a man," Amara said, turning back to Minjun. She didn't look at Hodgin again. "He's no longer a threat. He has no shadow to hide in." Minjun lowered the gun, looking at Amara with a new kind of respect. He had spent his life using force to solve problems, but she had used a different kind of power, the power of truth and consequence. "The Blackguard will take him," Minjun said, signaling to the men waiting outside. "He will spend the rest of his life in a cell, watching the world forget he ever existed." As the guards dragged Hodgin out into the rain, Minjun stood beside Amara. The cold wind blew into the container, but for the first time in years, the air felt clean. "You're a better teacher than I am," Minjun said quietly. "I just know that a king without a kingdom is just a ghost," Amara replied, looking out at the dark sea. The morning sun touched the front window of the bistro, turning the glass into a sheet of gold. Inside, the air smelled exactly as it always had, a comforting blend of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon, and floor wax. It was the only thing that hadn't changed. Amara stood behind the counter, the same spot where she had spent years taking orders and apologizing for mistakes she didn't make. She reached down and picked up a small, plastic rectangle. It was her old name tag, the edges slightly chipped, the name Amara printed in simple, fading ink. With a small smile, she pinned it to her lapel. The plastic looked strange against the fabric of her suit. The suit was a deep, midnight blue silk, hand-tailored and worth more than she used to earn in a year. It moved like water when she walked, a sharp contrast to the stiff, stained apron she had worn for so long. A soft chime announced a visitor. It wasn't a customer. The bistro was closed to the public today. Minjun stepped inside, followed by Nayeon, who was carrying a bouquet of bright yellow lilies. The Iron King looked different here, less like a statue of war and more like a man at peace. "The paperwork is finished," Minjun said, placing a leather folder on the counter. "The building, the land, and the 3 storefronts adjacent to it. They are all officially yours." Amara ran her hand over the polished wood of the counter. She had been the nobody who scrubbed these floors. Now, she was the owner of the very ground she stood on. But she was more than a landlord. She was the architect of the city's new peace. In a month since Hodgin's fall, her name had become a whisper that traveled through the highest halls of power. People didn't just fear the Blackguard anymore. They feared the voice that saw through every lie and broke every code. "You don't have to keep the name tag," Nayeon said with a playful grin, placing the flowers in a vase. "You're the most powerful woman in the city now, Amara. You could wear a crown if you wanted to." Amara looked at her reflection in the espresso machine's chrome surface. "I keep it to remind myself," she said softly. "The world thinks power is about how much you can take. But I learned here that power is about how much you can see." She looked at Minjun, who was watching her with a quiet, steady pride. He had given her the resources, but she had provided the vision. Together, they had turned a fortress into a home and a city of shadows into a place where the sun could finally rise. "What's the first order of business for the Queen's architect?" Minjun asked, a rare spark of humor in his eyes. Amara tucked the leather folder under her arm and headed toward the door. She looked back at the small, humble bistro one last time. It was no longer her cage. It was her foundation. "First," Amara said, her voice clear and resonant, "we find the others. There are more people like me. People the world calls nobodies who are hiding the secrets of the past. It's time we gave them a voice." As they walked out into the bustling street, the crowd parted instinctively. They didn't see a waitress or a servant. They saw a woman who moved with the grace of a queen and the sharp mind of a strategist. The nobody was gone. In her place stood the woman who had mastered the language of kings, ready to rewrite the story of the city, one word at a time.